the first thing we want to do is we want to actually create our localization settings. So we go to Edit, Project Settings, and we've got a localization tab here on the left now. And we haven't got any settings at the moment. So we click Create. That'll create a settings asset. So you only need one asset per project, and we're going to stick that into just a localization folder. You can stick it anywhere, it doesn't really matter. So in here now we've now got our settings. So we've got available locales. So that's the languages your game is going to support. So we call them locales because it's not just a language, but it can also include the region. So for example, if we wanted to add our languages to the game or locales, we click Add Locale. And then we've got a list of all of the supported ones we have, but we can also add ones that aren't in the list if we wanted to by clicking the Add Custom Locale. So for example, if we went to French, you can see we've got French, but then we've also got regional versions such as Canada, Mali, and lots of other ones. So we could, if we wanted to, add translations for specific regions, and that's useful if, say, you have certain slang or certain words that might be interpreted differently in certain countries. And then we could maybe have general translations so that you might fall back. So you'd have some very specifics for like maybe French Canada, and then you'd fall back to general French. So for our demo today, we're just going to add languages. We're not going to do any regional stuff. So we're going to add French, English, Spanish, and Japanese. So just because I have some translations already prepared. So we click Add Locales, and these are assets. Each locale is an asset, so we can save that somewhere. So I'm going to put it in here. I say it's now created 4 locale assets, and you can click on them and inspect them, and they have some information. They've got a name which you can customize. They've got a locale code, so we use a standardized way of referencing like languages or codes, which is the language hyphen and then the region. And if you go in the documentation, it'll tell you about the ISO standards, where that comes from. We've got this thing called culture info. So .NET has a lot of information about languages and cultures already in there, and we can pull that information out. And that means we've managed to match it up to one of the .NET culture infos, which means that we already have formatting information. So we can do currency, date, time, number formatting. So if you want to do very specific formatting, such as a date for the language, then that information is already available to us. So the last thing we should point out here is we've got this locale selectors. So when your application starts up at the beginning, it needs a way to know what language it's going to start up in, and that's what this is for. So the way it works is you give it different methods to try, and it attempts each one from the top going down to the bottom until it succeeds. So for example here, it's going to check the command line to see if a user's maybe passed in an argument for a custom language. And we're not running with any command line arguments at the moment, so that would fail. So it would then try the next one, the system locale selector, which is a little bit more advanced. I'm just going to go back to the slides. So the system locale selector is different depending on the platform. So for example, if it's running on iOS, the first thing it's going to do is it's going to check your what's called the preferred language. So that is where you can click on an application and you can change the language just for that application instead of having sort of the operating system language. And Android has a similar feature. If that fails, say it's not been set or you're not on one of those platforms, then the next thing it does is check the system culture. So that is where .NET can tell you what the operating system language is. So it'll then check that. And when it does that, it'll also check to fallback. So for example, if it was in French Canada and you only had French on your game, then it would check and it would know that French Canada has a relationship to that language. And so it would pick that. So it would fall back from French Canada to French and pick that language in your game. And you can customize these fallbacks as well if you need to. So if it didn't have French, then it would fail. And so the last thing we would go to is what's called the specific locale selector. I'll just go back to Unity. And this is, if you want it to you always want it to start in a certain language and you don't care what the language on the machine is, you can just set this. It's like the fallback here. So for our example, we're just going to use English as the startup. So we're going to remove these ones. And another one that's worth pointing out is there's different ones here. You can create custom ones as well. It's the player pref locale selector. So if we add that, if later on we change the language, then it will remember that change in the player preferences. so that next time you start the game, it will keep that language set. So there's already like a setting, a configuration in there for you. You don't have to create your own, or you could if you wanted to. So if we do that now, then if we change get the language later on and we start up again, it'll go to the language we had before. It won't keep resetting to English. So I'll close that now. There's some other settings that we might look at later on. Another useful one, just to quickly draw out, is the project locale. That is more of an editor hint. So it tells it what language we're building the game in. And so at times when it doesn't know what language to display, it knows to fall back to this project locale because it knows that's the language I'm using as my default. So it's more of a hint. It doesn't do anything in the player. So we'll just set that and then we'll close that down. So we're going to open UI Builder now. So we're going to be looking at UI Toolkit. So we go to Window, UI Toolkit, UI Builder. I'm just going to dock that. So the first thing we want to do is add a label. So we've got our label and we now want to localize this label. So we need to give it some information, some localized data. So to do that, we can go to Window, Asset Management, Localization Tables. And this is our table editor. It's got nothing in it at the moment because we haven't got any tables. So the first thing we want to do is create a string table. And a table is like a spreadsheet where you have your keys down the side and then you have each language across the top. And so it lets you put in all those translations. So we'll create a string table and we'll just call it my strings. And we have the option of what languages we want it to support. So we just leave it as default and we'll support them all. And you can add languages later on. You don't have to do it all up front. So we'll just save that and that will create several assets for us. So here you can see the assets is created. It's created a string table for each language. It's created what's called the shared data, which is basically what the data that's used by all languages. And then it's got this editor asset, which lets us add sort of extra information we can. Say if we wanted to configure it to connect to like a Google Sheets, which I'll talk a bit about later. So here's our string table now, and there's nothing in it at the moment. So we're going to click New Entry. And we're going to give it an entry. So we're just going to say hello. So the key is how you're going to reference it. So it could just be the English word or the original translation, or you could have a naming convention. It's really up to you. So for example, a lot of people like to do like a naming system like this. ID hello. Then I'll put the English in, the French, the Spanish, and I'm going to copy and paste the Japanese because I haven't got a Japanese keyboard. So we've got our entry and we've got the translations in there. So we'll close that down now. So we now want to connect that localized value to our label. So you've probably seen this before. You've seen UI Toolkit's binding system. So if we right click on the text, we have this option called binding, add binding. And you can bind to pretty much all these fields and style fields, and you can connect different types of data to them. And with the localization package, you now have a custom binding. So if we go into type, like default, we now have this Unity localization bindings. And we have lots of different types. So we have localized string is what we're going to use now. So if we click on that, we want to select the entry that we just created. So you can see there it is, ID hello. I'm going to change the view so it's a bit easier. So you can see it's the table name / and the entry name. And you can also filter once you start to get large tables, and it's useful to be able to filter it. So double click that and now I can see it's telling me the default is English. It gets that from our project locale we set before. And then it's got the translated values, which we can have a look at as well. So we click add binding and now it's been localized. So we can now switch that language. If we go to Window, Asset Management, Scene Controls, we get this little control here. So I'm just going to dock this up here. And it's got a language changer. So I now click French. You can see it's changed to French, Japanese, Spanish. So we can just scroll through those languages and we can preview them in the builder. So the next thing you'll probably want to do is you're going to want to change the font, because it's very rare that a font will support every single language your game needs. You're going to want to have a different font per language. In this instance, it does support it, but we'll assume it doesn't, and we want to change to a different type of font. So we want to create a asset table. So Window, Asset Management, Localization Table. So we're back to here again. So we've got our string table. Now we want to create a new table for assets. So we click New Table Collection. And we go Asset Table. And I'll just call this My Assets. I'm just going to create that, and that'll create a lot of assets again, like it did for string table. I'll create it in there. So like before, we've got a spreadsheet view again. We click new entry, but this time instead of strings, we've got little slots we can drag an asset into, and it can be any type of Unity asset. So I'm going to call this flag. No, not flag. I'm going to call it font. So now I've got some fonts that I got from Google. So the Google Noto Sans and the Japanese one. So I'm going to drag that in. I'm going to use this font for all languages except for Japanese. So I just drag and drop it in. Okay, and so now I've got Japanese there, and the rest are just going to use the normal Noto Sans. So I'll close that. I'll go to my label now. I can go down to where the font is assigned, which is under the styles, text, font. I can right click, and like before, I can do add binding. And now I've got the option again to go in here, and I can change it to a localized font this time. So I click that. And the same as before, I'll select that entry I just added. So my asset / ID font. And I can see the fonts that I've been assigned. So I could change it here if I needed to. And click add binding. And now you can see, if I just expand that a little bit, it's using that font. So if I change it to French, it's the same font. Japanese, it switches to that font. So we've now localized the text and the font for the label, and that's connected up to it. So finally, we'll just show one more asset. So we could do a texture. So for this, we're going to do flags. Flags are not languages, but for this example, we're going to use them as that one. So we're going to add a visual element. And we're going to go back to Window, Asset Management, Tables. And we're going to add another asset to this table. And we'll just call it ID_flag. And I also have some flag assets from earlier, so I can just drag these in. And what it's actually doing when we're dragging these in is it's not just assigning these to some asset table. It's actually working with what's called the addressable assets system. So that's another package that we have a dependency on. And it's setting up these each of these assets into special groups, which become asset bundles. And that means you can set your game up to say, come with English installed, and you could have the other languages on a server. And then when you switch the language, it could go off and fetch those other languages. It means you can distribute content updates. So you could have a language pack that comes at a later date. You don't have to have all those languages when you build the game and release it. You could add them at a later date. You can add other translations. And this is all kind of underneath the localization system. So you don't have to do anything to it if you don't want to. You can use the default. But if you want to go more advanced, you can start to set these language packs up. And I'll just add that last one in. So now we can go in here, and like before, this time instead we're going to do the background. So we go to the image, right click, add binding. You can see the property path here. So style background image. I'm going to click type, and this time I'm going to go for a localized texture. Select entry. There's our flag. Select that. Add binding. And I'm also going to change it so that it scales to fit, so it doesn't distort it. So now we've got text, font, and an asset, and we can just switch between them. So I'm just going to save that. So I go back to our deck for a second. I can't fit it up here. So what we've just shown there is essentially connecting the localization data to a single label. So for font, if you had a lot of labels, each label that was connected to a localized font would have to do essentially a lookup in a table. We'll look up, find the table, look up in the table, and then it might have to load the asset, which is only done once. So for performance, if we know we're going to use the same asset across multiple bindings, we could take advantage of what's called a data source. So we can have a single source of the data that we bind to, and then we can have lots of users. And this means that it'll only have to do that lookup once, and it helps with the performance. But it also means that if you want to change that font, maybe for all of those assets, you don't have to go and change each binding, you can just change that data source. So we're going to do a little example now to show you how to do that. So we'll go back to Unity again. So I'm going to show you an example scene we've got. So here we have a menu built in UI Toolkit. Originally this was a UGUI demo, And then it was built in UI Toolkit as part of the UI Toolkit samples a few years ago. So I've taken that example. It's just a very simple menu. And we want to have the same font apply to all of these. So we don't really need to bind every single item. We just want to have a single binding that gets applied to all of them. So that can be done with a data source. So if I go into my scripts, I've got my data source. I'm going to open Visual Studio. So here's our data source. And for most of this demonstration, we're not going to do a lot of coding because we want to show a no-code approach mainly, but I'm going to do a little bit here. But a lot of what I do through UI Builder can also be done through code. So we've got a scriptable object, so that will create an asset for us. And in this, we want to have a font that we're going to bind against. So we're not going to use a localized font to bind against. And there are two reasons for that. The first one is if you want to bind against a localized font, the binding system needs a converter. It needs to know how to convert that font, that localized font, to a font, and we don't have one of them. You could add one quite easily, but that makes it a little bit more complicated because addressables, I was talking about before, loads in an asynchronous way, so it doesn't load things instantly. So if you were in a converter and you wanted to convert a localized font to a font, you would expect it to load straight away. And you can force it by calling get localized asset, but not all platforms support that. For example, WebGL won't let you use that. So if we do it this way, we can approach it in a way that it'll work on all platforms and all the asynchronous loading will be handled for us, and we can get this performance benefits from it as well. We won't have stutters when we force things to load. So if we add the property we're going to bind against, and we use this create property so that the binding system knows it's there. And then we're going to also add a localized font, but that's not going to be bound against it. That's going to be working in the background. So what will happen is in onEnable, when the object gets created, we will subscribe to this asset changed event. And as soon as you subscribe to this event, it will trigger the loading or the asynchronous loading in the background. And actually, if you look at the documentation, it will explain it. So as soon as we add a subscriber to it, it triggers the loading and it starts to do all the asynchronous loading for us. And as soon as it's ready, it'll then call that event for us. So then we can assign the font to it. And if later on you change the language, it'll automatically update itself for us. So it handles all of that for us. All we have to do is just assign it back to the font. And then the binding system will detect that change and update it. So that's our data source. So we'll go back to Unity. Just wait for it to compile. Right. So now we're going to create the data source. If we right click, create, and we've got that my data source option. So that'll create a scriptable object for us. And then here's that font we sell. So we can just set that up to link to the font we added earlier. So now if we go and open the UXML file, so it's called menu. So I can click on it here, open this in the builder. So if I click on the root, I can drag that data source into this slot here called data source. So I'll just go here and drag that in. So now that data source will get used by the DAP and any children. And then we can go and click on each of these. And there's actually a few ways to do this. You could set the font in the root and it will share it for all the children. But for this example, I'm going to treat each one individually. Because if we had, say, lots of different UIs, then it would work this way for it. You wouldn't have, or they're not all sharing the same parent. So it's for the example, we're going to ignore that parent for this bit. So if we go to each piece of text, we can click on the text font like earlier, add binding, but this time we're not going to change it. We're going to leave it as the default binding, and we're going to click here and you'll see it's detected font from the data source, so we can just bind directly against that and then it updates it. So I would just do that for each of them. Add binding. And the last one. So now it's using that that single data source. So it'll only load the asset once and it'll only look it up once, but then it will apply it to all of those labels in one go. So you don't have to do the lookup for each individual label. So that's really useful if you have a single piece of data, but it's going to be used across multiple bindings. And instead of binding individually, a data source is a good approach for that. And for fonts, it's really useful because you'll often only have a couple of fonts that you're using across maybe multiple UIs. So if you put them into a data source, bind against that data source, then when that font needs to change, it'll only ever happen once and only need to be looked up once. So you get some nice performance benefits there. So the next thing I want to talk about is pseudo localization. So we've got our UI here. We haven't done any translations yet, but it's still worth applying, like setting it up for localization, even though it's not been translated yet. And I want to show you why you might want to do that. And it's for a technique called pseudo localization. So pseudo localization is a way you can simulate translations. So there's a lot of information out there on, like, for example, if you translate from English to say German, a lot of words will expand and get bigger. And so you can take some of that data and you can try and simulate. So you don't necessarily have to translate the words. You can just apply what might it look like if this text gets a bit bigger or if the fonts were changed. And you can use this technique to look for issues earlier on before you've had to do any translations. Not only that, but it can also look for areas where maybe you've missed localization. So for example, there's a technique where it will replace all of your text with, say, an underscore. And then if you look at your UI and you can still see some text, you know you've missed that. You haven't localized that area, so you can go and fix those issues. So it's a good way of debugging and looking for localization issues early on. And so it's got a lot of different techniques, and the docs go into the details. So we'll have a look at how we could apply pseudo localization to this menu. So we'll go back to Unity. So here's our menu. First thing we're going to do is actually create some entries then for this in our localization table. So we go back to Asset Management, Localization Tables, go to our string table, and we're going to add some entries. So we're going to add one called Menu. Then we'll have Menu Continue. Need to get the spelling right. Menu UGame. Menu settings, and finally the quick one. So we're not going to add any translations, we've just got English. So this is how would be a good way to work, is to just have your English translations as you go and then fill in all this later on. So now we'll go in and we'll set each one up. So first we want menu. So like before, I'll just minimize that. We go up here to text, add binding. We add a localized string, select entry, and there's menu. So we'll set that one up, add that one. Oh, and I need to change it back to English. So if you don't have a translation, you get this error message that tells you can't find the translation. So we'll go to English again. We're going to go to continue. I'm just going to quickly go for each of these now and localize them. So now we change it to say French. You can see they're all localized and they're all giving us an error message saying it's missing. So now we want to apply pseudo localization. So I'm just going to save that. So to create a pseudo locale, we can go, it's an asset. So we go into localization. I'll put it in the same place as my other locales. So you go in, you right click, create, under localization, a pseudo locale. And then it's the same as the locale editor. You can change the name, the culture info. So when it does the pseudo localization, it'll take the translations for your chosen language. So here it is English, and then it will apply it on top. So you can pseudo localize different languages. It doesn't have to be just the source language. And in here, we've got two new options, the methods and the preview. So the preview shows what it would look like if we pseudo localize that bit text. So here it's applying these methods. So it's got a thing called preserve tags. That's useful if you say have rich text or HTML and you don't want it to break the tags when it's pseudo localizing you. I'm just going to remove that because we're not using that at the moment. It's got the expander. So that's where it makes the text grow. And it doesn't just grow by the same amount. It applies some rules that you can define. So you can tell it, if it's a very small piece of text, grow by 200%. If it's large, then you'll only grow by maybe 30%, because once the text gets really big, it doesn't changes off as much for some languages. So you can get this information from various sources. In the documentation, we reference where we got this from. So if you want to try that one. Then you can say what it does is basically generates a lot of random characters, and it puts them at the end or the start of both. So I'll just say both. And you can configure the characters so that by default, there's lots of stuff in there. You could just change it to a single character if you want. I'm going to get rid of the accent, so that changes all the characters to the accented version. So that's good for checking height issues or missing fonts. So we're just going to do just growing the text. And finally, we've got the encapsulator. So that puts a bracket on both ends of the text. So you can tell then if it's been clipped if you can't see both brackets. So we'll go with that. So now we go back here to our language menu. You'll see we now have that pseudo locale as an option. It's like a language you can change to. So we'll click that. And we can see we've got some issues and the text doesn't fit most of the time. Here, you can still see the text, but it doesn't really fit in the blue area. But with the other ones, you can't see the opening and closing brackets. So not only does it not fit, but it's also being clipped or truncated. So we could see that if we were to translate this menu, there will be some issues. We might want to make a bit more space or adjust it for certain languages. And how you do that is a whole separate topic on its own, but one technique could be to have custom style sheets that you apply for each language, which might have overrides. But we don't have the time to go into a whole example of that. But what I will do is show you what it looks like if you did translate it to see if it's the same. So we've got our data. We go back to localization tables. We've got no translations at the moment, but we also have this option called import and export. So when you're working with translators, they're not going to be working in Unity most of the time. They're going to have their own set of tools. They're often working with just spreadsheets or other file formats. So we need a way to get that localization data out, let them translate it, and then bring it back in later on. So we support 3 formats by default. We have CSV, XLIF, which is an XML-based format that translators use, and Google Sheets. So in this, we've got some data we've already prepared in a CSV file. So we can click import, and we've got 2 options for CSV. We can just do import CSV, which just replaces everything, or we've got merge, where it will just try and bring in the data and merge it with what we've already got. So because I've used these names, I've already got data that matches those names. So if I click CSV merge, and I've got one called menu, open that, and there you go. You can see now we've got translations have been brought in. And we've still got the old data from before, so it's done the merge, it's not replaced it all. I'll close that, go back. So now let's see how they look. So I changed to French. You can see there's a few issues here. It's starting to get a bit close, but it does sort of fit. Change to Japanese. Now it's starting to go over. So you'd want to change the font size there so it fits a bit better. Go to Spanish, and now we're starting to get a bit more issues as well. It's not fitting here. So one way to fix this issue would be to change that font size, maybe just for that language, or you could try and get it to fit for all languages. And we go back to English.